In the quiet, industrial valley of Pine Ridge, people measure the worth of a man by two things: the brightness of his suit and the cleanliness of his hands. For over 20 years, the locals called me a failure. To them, I was just Gideon Cross, an impoverished, widowed black mechanic living in a crumbling garage at the muddy edge of town. A man who smelled permanently of gasoline and iron rust. A man who couldn't even afford a new pair of boots, let alone a life of dignity. They looked at the dark grease ground deep into the creases of my palms and saw a man at the very bottom of the world. But this morning, the heavy silence of Pine Ridge was shattered by the low, velvety hum of 3 luxury SUVs rolling slowly down the gravel road. I wiped my hands on a frayed, oil-stained rag, my breath hitching in my chest. Through the cracked glass of my workshop window, I watched as the small town came to a standstill. Neighbors peeked out from their porches, whispering behind cupped hands. The heavy doors of the vehicles clicked open. 3 young adults stepped out into the damp morning air. One wore the crisp, white coat of a chief cardiothoracic surgeon. Another was dressed in the tailored charcoal suit of a corporate financial director. And the third, a young woman whose sharp gaze held the authority of a federal trial attorney, stood tall beside them. A sudden, sharp murmur rippled through the gathering crowd. "Aren't those the 3 orphaned kids the state court dragged away from old Gideon 10 years ago?" A neighbor whispered loudly enough for the wind to carry. "Did they come back to foreclose on that broken-down heap of a garage?" They didn't know. They had no idea. The eldest brother walked up the broken concrete steps of my porch. In his hands, he carried a velvet-lined wooden box. He didn't look at the staring crowd. He didn't care about the whispers. He simply raised his hand and knocked gently 3 rhythmic taps against the rusted iron door. My hands trembled as I unlocked the heavy bolt. The iron door slid open with a low, metallic groan, sending a dusting of red rust through the air. I stood in the doorway, a tall, frail man with silvering hair, wearing my faded blue utility jumpsuit stained with motor oil and carbon dust. My left eye was clouded over with pale gray scar tissue, a permanent reminder of the night I lost everything. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, the young surgeon looked at me. His eyes, once those of a frightened 8-year-old boy crying in the dark, filled with tears. "We're home, Dad," he whispered. To understand why those 3 successful adults came back to a broken mechanic's yard, you have to go back to the beginning, back to a time when this town believed a man with grease on his hands had no right to be a father. 15 years ago, I worked as a senior mechanic at the regional shipyards. I was a man of simple pleasures. I had a wife whose laughter could light up the darkest room, a modest home, and a trade I was proud of. But in a single night, the world I knew was burned to ash. An industrial boiler exploded in Section 4. The fire spread like a hungry beast, tearing through the wooden beams and iron pipes. I rushed into the blinding smoke, pulling 2 workers out by their collars. But when I went back in for my wife, the roof collapsed. I survived, but my soul stayed in those ashes. 2 of my closest friends, fellow shipwrights who worked beside me every day, perished in that same blaze. They left behind 3 helpless, innocent children: Julian, who was 8, Damien, who was 6, and little Nora, who was barely 4 years old. The weight of survivor's guilt ate away at my bones like acid. I couldn't bear to look at the shipyards anymore. I took my meager savings, quit my job, and bought a small, run-down repair shop at the edge of Pine Ridge. I thought if I stayed quiet, worked with my hands, and kept my head down, the world would leave me alone to grieve. Then came the rainy Tuesday that changed my life forever. A caseworker from social services parked her sedan in front of my shop. She stepped inside, holding a thick manila folder, her rain boots clicking against the concrete floor. "Mr. Cross," she said softly, her voice heavy with fatigue, "the state is preparing to place Julian, Damien, and Nora into separate foster facilities tomorrow morning. No single family is willing to take all 3 siblings together. Their uncle and aunt, Giles and Valerie Sterling, have officially refused legal guardianship." She set 3 small photographs on my workbench, right next to a disassembled carburetor. I looked down at those 3 little faces. Their eyes were wide, filled with a hollow, terrifying sorrow that I recognized all too well. It was the same darkness that lived inside my own chest. I walked over to the cracked mirror hanging above the sink. I looked at the long, jagged burned scar running up my neck. I looked at my broad, dark hands stained with black engine oil that no amount of harsh lye soap could ever fully wash away. Look at yourself, Gideon, a dark voice inside me whispered. You're just a poor, widowed black mechanic. You live in a workshop that smells of diesel and old tires. How can a man like you raise three traumatized children? What do you have to offer them? I looked back at the photographs on the counter. If I turned them away, those three children would be torn apart. They would grow up in different homes, forgetting the sound of their mother's voice, losing the only blood connection they had left in this cold world. My chest tightened. The self-doubt inside me was crushed under a sudden, overwhelming wave of fierce, unconditional love. I picked up the pen from the counter, my hand steady as iron, and signed my name at the bottom of the guardianship papers. I'm taking them home, I said. Standing on the threshold of my shop 10 years later, looking into the eyes of Julian, Damien, and Nora, the floodgates of memory burst open. The crowd gathered around my property grew denser, their breath misting in the cold morning air of Pine Ridge. I could hear the sharp, venomous murmurs buzzing among the townspeople like flies over a carcass. Look at him, gossiped Mrs. Gable, the butcher's wife, leaning over her fence with narrowed eyes, standing there in those filthy rags. After all these years, he still looks like a common tramp. And those children, they must have come back to see the wreck they escaped from. Her husband grunted in agreement, a black mechanic trying to play father to three white orphans. It was an abomination from the start. The court was right to tear them away from him. Their words cut through the damp air, sharp and unfeeling. It was the exact same chorus of hatred that had greeted me 15 years ago when I brought three frightened, heartbroken children home in the back of my rusty pickup truck. In those early days, the town made sure I felt the weight of my skin and the poverty of my trade every single hour. When I took Julian to enroll at the local elementary school, the principal didn't even offer me a chair. He sat behind his polished oak desk, staring at my worn blue jumpsuit and the faint smell of motor oil that clung to my skin despite 3 rounds of scrubbing. Mr. Cross, the principal had sneered, sliding Julian's registration papers back across the desk with the tip of a pencil, as if touching them directly might contaminate him. This is a reputable district. We have standards. Are you quite sure you can afford the textbook fees? Or will we be chasing a night shift mechanic for nickel and dime payments all semester? I remembered sitting in that stiff chair, my jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached, swallowing my pride for the sake of the boy standing nervously beside me. Julian had squeezed my hand, his tiny fingers trembling inside my massive, callous palm. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice. I simply pulled a crumpled stack of hard-earned $20 bills from my pocket, counted them out one by one, and laid them neatly on his desk. My money is clean, sir, I said softly, my baritone steady as gravel, and my son will be in his seat on Monday morning. Every day was an uphill battle against a town that wanted us to fail. Storekeepers watched Julian, Damien, and Nora with suspicious eyes whenever they walked down Main Street, whispering that the mechanic street rats were probably shoplifting. Parents forbade their children from playing with them, warning their kids to stay away from the dirty garage at the edge of the woods. The hostility wasn't just outside our walls, it lived inside our home too. The trauma of losing their parents in that terrifying shipyard explosion left deep, jagged scars on the children's young minds. Damien, who was only 6, suffered from night terrors so severe he would wake up screaming, his chest heaving as he relived the roar of the collapsing roof. He would throw himself against the bedroom wall, kicking and sobbing, convinced the room was filling with smoke. Little Nora refused to speak a single word for the first 6 months. She clung to her stuffed bear, hiding behind the worn sofa whenever a heavy truck rumbled past the workshop, her small body trembling uncontrollably. And Julian, poor, brave Julian, carried the heavy burden of being the eldest. He refused to sleep in his own bed. Every night, he would pull a chair up to his sibling's bedroom door, sitting guard with a wooden toy sword, his eyes wide and bloodshot, determined to protect them from a world that had already robbed them of everything. I was a man who knew how to rebuild an 8-cylinder engine with my eyes closed, but I knew nothing about fixing broken hearts. I was terrified. Every night, after the children finally drifted off into a restless sleep, I would sit alone on the edge of my creaky cot, staring at my grease-stained hands under the dim light of a single hanging bulb. How do I heal them? I asked the silence. How do I teach them to be strong in a world that hates us? I knew I couldn't buy them expensive toys or take them on fancy vacations. I couldn't change the color of my skin or erase the prejudices of Pine Ridge, but I had my hands, my sweat, and an unconditional love that burned hotter than any furnace. So I built our life on 3 sacred rules, 3 daily rituals designed to forge an unbreakable bond that no amount of hatred could ever shatter. Standing on that porch 10 years later, looking at the 3 incredible adults standing before me, I saw the fruits of those hard, painful years. Julian stepped closer, his polished leather shoes crunching on the gravel where my rusted oil drums used to sit. He ignored the whispering neighbors, ignored the cold rain beginning to fall, and looked at me with an intensity that shook me to my core. He raised the velvet box in his hands. "They thought they broke us, Dad," Julian said, his voice ringing out across the silent street, thick with emotion yet loud enough for every gossiping neighbor to hear. "They thought a judge's gavel and a wealthy aunt's money could erase what you gave us in this garage." Damien stepped up beside his brother, his charcoal suit immaculate, his eyes shining with unshed tears as he looked at my scarred face. "They called you a failure, Dad. But everything I know about honor, everything I know about survival, I learned right here, washing grease off these floors." Nora, her legal briefcase resting on the wooden porch railing, wrapped her arms around my waist, burying her face into my oil-stained chest just like she used to do when she was 4 years old. "We didn't come back to look at the past, Dad," Nora whispered, her voice carrying a sharp, triumphant edge that cut through the foggy morning air. "We came back to bring the storm." To survive in a town that wished for our ruin, I knew affection alone was not enough. Love needed structure. It needed proof, something tangible that those 3 traumatized children could touch, smell, and hold onto when the nightmares returned in the dark of night. So, within the grease-scented walls of my workshop, I established 3 sacred rituals. The first ritual happened every evening at 6 o'clock sharp, no matter how many cars were waiting in the bay. No matter how exhausted my back felt from hauling iron flywheels, I would turn off the air compressor and lead the children to the deep industrial sink in the corner of the garage. We would stand side by side in a row before the galvanized steel basin. I would pump a heavy dollop of harsh, abrasive orange pumice soap into their tiny hands and cup my large, dark palms under the cold tap water. Together, we would scrub. Scrub, scrub, scrub. "Look at the water, kids," I would say softly as the suds turned dark gray, swirling down the drain. "The town looks at my hands and sees dirt. They think because a man works in a pit, his soul is dirty too. But this grease is honest work. It bought the bread on our table tonight, and it paid for the shoes on your feet. Never let anyone make you bow your head because your father earns his living with his sweat." 6-year-old Damien would look up at me, his small hands sudsy up to his elbows, trying his best to mimic the firm, deliberate scrubbing motion of my Kala's palms. "Is my money clean too, Dad?" he would ask, his eyes wide. "Cleaner than gold, son," I'd answer, drying his tiny hands with a clean flour sack towel. "Cleaner than gold." The second ritual was born out of my trade. In a mechanic's shop, gears are everything. A single gear with a broken tooth can stall an entire engine, but when teeth mesh together in perfect alignment, they can lift a mountain. Whenever Julian brought home a report card with top marks, whenever Damien mustered the courage to speak up in class, or whenever little Nora managed to go an entire week without hiding under her bed during a thunderstorm, I would take them into my small tool room. There, using a fine jeweler's file and a small brass hammer, I would take a small steel gear from a scrapped clockwork transmission. I would carefully smooth down the edges, stamp the child's initials into the metal, and polish it until it shone like silver. Then, I would loop a sturdy leather cord through the center and fasten it around their neck. "This isn't just a piece of metal," I would tell them, kneeling down so I was eye to eye with each child. "This gear means you are strong. It means you are part of a machine that cannot be broken. As long as we mesh together, no storm in this world can stop us." Nora, who still refused to speak to strangers in town, would clutch her little brass gear with both hands, pressing it against her heart, as if it were a magical shield against the world. She wore that gear inside her shirt every single day, sleeping with it against her skin. And the third ritual was our Saturday night supper. Saturdays were brutal. The shop was always packed with farmers needing their tractors repaired before Sunday, and I would work 14 hours straight without sitting down once. But when 8 o'clock struck, the heavy bay doors were pulled down and locked against the cold Pine Ridge wind. I would wipe down the heavy oak workbench in the center of the shop, cover it with a checkered tablecloth, and bring out a massive cast iron pot of beef and potato stew that had been simmering on the small kerosene stove in the office since dawn. We sat around that workbench like a council of kings. In those hours, there were no teachers calling them names, no storekeepers eyeing them with suspicion, and no memories of the burning shipyard. There was only the thick, rich steam of hot broth, the smell of warm garlic bread I toasted over the shop heater, and the sound of their laughter echoing against the metal rafters. Julian would talk about his dream of becoming a doctor, waving a wooden spoon in the air as he explained how the human heart was just a remarkably complex hydraulic pump. Damien would figure out the exact cost per gallon of our kerosene stove, demonstrating a frightening natural talent for numbers. And little Nora would sit beside me, quietly dipping her bread into the stew, leaning her head against my arm with a contentment that money could never buy. For 3 years, those rituals were our fortress. We were building something beautiful out of the ruins of our lives. Then came the winter of my 45th year, the winter the ice came to Pine Ridge, and the sky turned the color of lead. It was a Tuesday midnight in mid-January. A severe ice storm had knocked out the power grid across the county, plunging the town into pitch-black freezing darkness. The temperature inside our uninsulated workshop plummeted rapidly, turning our breath into thick white clouds. To keep the children warm, I lit the old cast-iron wood stove in the corner of the living quarters behind the shop, stacking heavy oak logs inside until the iron belly glowed a dull, comforting orange. I tucked Julian, Damien, and Nora into the big double bed under 4 layers of heavy wool blankets, making sure their leather gear necklaces were tucked safely inside their pajamas. "Sleep tight, little ones," I whispered, kissing each of their foreheads. "Dad is right outside in the bay fixing the emergency generator for the clinic." I pulled on my heavy canvas coat, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out into the freezing repair bay to finish wiring an alternator. I didn't know that 50 yards away, inside the wooden storage shed where I kept 5-gallon drums of solvent and spare tires, an ancient overhead electric wire had snapped under the weight of a 2-inch shell of ice. The live, high-voltage wire whipped down through the rotting cedar shingles of the shed roof, landing directly on a stack of dried pine pallets sitting beside a leaking drum of industrial degreaser. A single spark was all it took. Within 90 seconds, while I was under the hood of a tractor 30 feet away, the storage shed burst into a roaring, gasoline-fueled wall of fire. The freezing Arctic wind caught the towering sheets of flame and drove them straight toward the back wall of our home, right toward the bedroom window where my 3 children lay fast asleep. The crackle of dry pine burning sounds almost like applause until you realize it's the sound of your life collapsing. I smelled the acrid reek of burning rubber before I saw the light. Dropping my wrench, I lunged toward the back hallway. The wooden partition separating the shop from our small sleeping quarters was already a curtain of leaping orange fire. Dense, suffocating black smoke poured through the doorframe, thick as liquid tar. "Julian! Damien! Nora!" I roared, my voice breaking over the thunder of the blaze. There was no time to find a wet cloth, no time to think. The instinct of a man who had already lost his wife to the flames took over completely. I smashed through the burning drywall with my bare shoulder, tumbling into the inferno of the bedroom. The heat was blinding, searing the skin of my face instantly. The cedar ceiling beams above the children's bed were groaning, sagged under the weight of falling embers. Julian was awake, coughing violently, his arms thrown over his younger brother and sister. Little Nora was screaming, trapped beneath a heavy, charred blanket that had caught a stray ember. I grabbed Julian and Damien by their coats, throwing them behind me toward the cooler air of the workshop floor. "Run to the driveway. Go!" I turned back for Nora. Just as my hands locked around her waist, a 6-inch thick ceiling joist, heavy with glowing embers, snapped with a sound like a rifle shot and plummeted straight toward Nora's head. I didn't think. I threw my body over hers, taking the full impact of the white-hot timber across my upper back and the left side of my face. Pain sharp, white, and sickening exploded behind my eyes. I felt the skin of my neck sizzle as the burning wood pinned me to the floorboards. The smell of my own burning flesh filled my nostrils, but I forced my legs to drive upward, heaving the crushing weight off my spine with a desperate, primal scream. I scooped Nora into my chest, cradling her head against my collarbone, and charged blindly through the wall of fire. We burst out onto the icy gravel driveway, just as the roof of the living quarters caved in with a deafening roar, sending a fountain of golden sparks 80 feet into the freezing night sky. I collapsed onto the snow, coughing up black soot, clutching all 3 children against my chest. They were safe, unharmed save for a few singed hairs. But as I lay there in the freezing slush, watching the flames consume 30 years of my hard work, the left side of my face went completely numb. The gray cloud in my left eye settled in forever. The fire destroyed half the shop, but the real destruction began 3 weeks later. I was lying in a narrow bed at the county hospital, my back wrapped in thick layers of ointment-soaked gauze, my left eye permanently clouded over with scar tissue. My hands were shaking from nerve damage, unable to grip even a plastic cup without trembling. I was bankrupt, homeless, and crippled. The door to my hospital room swung open. In walked Giles and Valerie Sterling. Giles wore a tailored camel hair coat, his leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. Valerie trailed behind him, holding a scented handkerchief to her nose as if the smell of hospital antiseptic was offensive to her delicate sensibilities. In their hands was not a basket of fruit or a card of sympathy. Giles held a thick stack of legal documents bound in a blue folder. "Gideon," Giles said, his voice dripping with false, condescending pity as he stood at the foot of my bed. "What a tragic turn of events. We came as soon as we heard about your unfortunate accident." I tried to sit up, but the searing pain in my back nailed me to the mattress. "Where are my kids?" I rasped, my throat raw from smoke damage. "Where are Julian, Damien, and Nora?" "They are currently in the custody of Child Protective Services," Valerie chimed in, her voice cold and sharp as an icicle. "Where they belong, frankly. You can't even feed yourself, Gideon. Look at you. You're a crippled, unemployed black man living in a burned-out garage. You have no insurance, no savings, and no eye." Giles laid the blue folder on my bedside table, tapping it with a gold-ringed finger. "We have filed an emergency petition for full custody," Giles said smoothly, a predatory glint in his eyes. "The court hearing is tomorrow morning. We've already secured the judge's preliminary signature. You are medically unfit, financially insolvent, and structurally incapable of providing a home." "They are my children," I choked out, tears of humiliation and rage burning my eyes. "I bled for them. I took a burning beam for Nora. You abandoned them when their parents died. You didn't want them." Giles leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive peppermint. The smug, cruel smile on his face widened. "We didn't want them then, Gideon," Giles whispered, lowering his voice so the nurse in the hallway couldn't hear. "But last week, the shipyard's corporate insurance liability settlement finally cleared probate. Those 3 little orphans are now the sole beneficiaries of a $2.4 million trust fund, a trust fund that requires an adult legal guardian to manage until they turn 21. My heart stopped. The world around me spun into a sickening blur. It was never about love. It was never about giving them a proper home. It was about the blood money left behind by my dead friends. The next morning, 2 sheriff's deputies escorted me into the county courtroom in a wheelchair. My back was bleeding through my bandages, my left eye blind, my clothes borrowed and ill-fitting. I sat at the defense table alone. No lawyer would take my case without a retainer I couldn't pay. Across the aisle sat Giles and Valerie, flanked by 2 high-priced corporate attorneys in silk ties. The judge didn't even look at me. He looked at my medical report, looked at Giles's bank statements, and banged his gavel 3 times. "Guardianship is officially transferred to Mr. and Mrs. Sterling," the judge declared coldly. "The court finds Mr. Gideon Cross physically and financially incapable of providing a safe environment." I remember the sound of that gavel. It sounded like a cell door slamming shut. As the deputies wheeled me out of the courtroom, I saw the 3 children being led down the hallway by Valerie. Damien was crying hysterically, his small shoes dragging on the linoleum. Julian was struggling against a bailiff's grip, his face red as he screamed my name over and over. "Dad, Dad, don't let them take us. Dad." And little Nora, as Valerie dragged her toward the heavy glass doors of the courthouse, Nora looked back at me over her shoulder. She reached inside her coat, pulled out the small brass gear necklace I had made for her, and held it high in the air with both hands, clutching it like a lifeline as the doors slammed shut between us. 10 years is a long time to live as a ghost. After the court tore Julian, Damien, and Nora from my arms, Pine Ridge assumed I would simply die out of sight. I didn't. I rebuilt the garage brick by scorched brick, working 18-hour days with a crippled back and a blind eye. Every dime I earned from fixing farm trucks and tractor engines was split into two piles, one to keep the roof over my head, and the other to mail in crisp postal money orders to the Sterling estate in the city. Every single month for a decade, without fail, I sent $100 for each child, accompanied by a letter. $300 a month, a fortune for a broke mechanic, just so my children would know their father had not abandoned them. I never received a reply, not a single phone call, not a single photograph. What I didn't know during those 10 agonizing years that Giles and Valerie Sterling had built a fortress of lies. The moment they brought the children into their sprawling suburban mansion, they confiscated every piece of mail bearing my name. My letters were thrown straight into the incinerator. My money orders were cashed into a private account and hidden away. They told the children I had moved away, that I had forgotten them, that the poor black mechanic had surrendered them the moment the state offered him a modest settlement check for his burn injuries. For 10 years, Julian, Damien, and Nora grew up under the cold, suffocating roof of the Sterlings. Giles used their $2.4 million shipyard trust fund to finance his failed real estate ventures, living off the interest while treating the three siblings like inconvenient houseguests. They were given clothes and shelter, but never love. Yet Giles made one fatal mistake. He underestimated the foundation I had built in that greasy garage. He couldn't wash away the three sacred rituals. Even in the pristine, sterile environment of the Sterling mansion, the children kept the pact. Every Saturday night at 8 o'clock, away from Giles's watchful eyes, Julian, Damien, and Nora would gather in the attic bedroom. They didn't have my cast-iron beef stew, so they shared whatever bread and fruit they could sneak from the kitchen. They sat in a circle, holding their worn brass gear necklaces beneath the dim light of a flashlight, repeating the words I had taught them. As long as we mesh together, no storm in this world can stop us. The breaking point came on Julian's 25th birthday, the day he officially came of age to access his portion of the trust fund. Julian, having clawed his way through medical school on relentless grit and sleepless nights, requested a full forensic audit of the estate's accounts from the trust bank. When the senior auditor handed over the thick leather ledger, Julian sat in his cramped apartment kitchen alongside Damien, now a brilliant corporate accountant, and Nora, who had just passed her state bar exam. Damien's sharp eyes scanned the financial ledgers. Within 2 hours, his red pen had circled over 40 fraudulent wire transfers executed by Giles, Sterling, millions drained from their parents' death benefits to cover Giles's gambling debts and bad investments. But it was the last page of the audit that broke their hearts. Filed away in the bank's archives was a record of 300 endorsed postal money orders spanning 10 solid years, originating from a small post office in Pine Ridge. Attached to the bank's records were carbon copies of the short, handwritten notes I had included with every payment. To my brave boy Julian, study hard. Dad is still here. To my smart boy Damien, keep counting the stars. Dad loves you. To my sweet girl Nora, keep your gear close. Dad is fighting for you. Julian wept over those yellowed receipts, his tears smudging the ink of my handwriting. Damien's jaw set into stone, and Nora, pulling her brass gear from beneath her collar, stood up from the table with a cold, terrifying resolve. The Sterlings hadn't just stolen their money, they had stolen 10 years of a father's love. They had turned a hero into a phantom and built a mansion on top of his broken back. Which brings us back to this freezing, foggy morning in Pine Ridge. The townspeople surrounding my driveway watched in stunned, breathless silence as Julian, Damien, and Nora stood beside me on the rotting wooden porch of my workshop. Julian turned toward the crowd of neighbors who had spent a decade mocking my name, his voice, trained to command surgical suites, cut through the morning mist with the force of a thunderclap. 10 years ago, this town stood by and watched a corrupt court steal 3 children from the bravest man who ever walked these hills. Julian shouted, gesturing toward me with his trembling hand. You called him a filthy mechanic. You called him a failure because he didn't wear a tie and had grease on his hands. Mrs. Gable, the butcher's wife, shrank back behind her fence. The townspeople fidgeted, their faces turning pale as the gravity of their cruelty hung heavy in the air. My father took a burning roof on his spine to save my sister, Julian continued, his voice echoing off the metal roofs of the street. He worked 18 hours a day with one eye and a broken back to send us every cent he had while the respectable white relatives you praised were stealing our dead parents' money. At that exact moment, the siren of a state police cruiser waded through the fog, its red and blue lights flashing against the wet pavement. The cruiser pulled up right behind the luxury SUVs. Two uniformed state troopers stepped out, followed by an official escort from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And from the back seat of the cruiser, handcuffed and pale as death, stepped Giles and Valerie Sterling. Giles Sterling stumbled as the federal agent guided him toward the gravel, his polished leather shoes splashing through a puddle of dirty rain and engine oil. The pristine camel hair coat he wore 10 years ago was gone, replaced by a rumpled gray suit. His wife, Valerie, hid her face from the townspeople's stares, her hands trembling inside heavy steel handcuffs. Nora stepped down from the porch, her high heels clicking firmly against the wet pavement. She held a thick, blue-bound legal docket, the federal indictment for grand larceny, wire fraud, and systemic embezzlement of a miners' trust fund. Giles Sterling, Nora said, her voice dropping like an iron gavel in the quiet street. As a licensed officer of the court, I personally filed the federal injunction freezing your assets 3 hours ago. The bank records, the intercepted postal money orders, and 10 years of fraudulent tax filings have all been submitted to the state attorney general. Giles looked up, his face pale and sunken, his arrogant posture completely shattered. He looked at Nora, then at Damien's cold, unyielding glare, and finally at Julian standing tall in his doctor's coat. Desperate, Giles turned his bloodshot eyes toward me, standing on the porch in my faded blue jumpsuit. Gideon, Giles rasped, his voice cracking with a pathetic, whimpering plea. Gideon, talk to them. Tell them we were family. We took them in when you couldn't. We gave them a roof. I didn't step down from the porch. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked down at him with my one good eye calm, deep and unbothered by the ghost of his arrogance. You didn't give them a home, Giles, I said, my baritone carrying across the silent crowd like a low tolling bell. You gave them a cage built out of blood money. You took my children, but you couldn't take what I built inside them. You can't steal character with a forged signature. The federal agents led Giles and Valerie back into the rear seat of the cruiser. As the doors slammed shut and the flashing red and blue lights faded into the morning fog of Pine Ridge, a heavy, suffocating silence settled over the townspeople watching from their porches. Mrs. Gable, the butcher's wife who had spent 15 years calling me a tramp, slowly lowered her head, staring down at her boots in silent shame. Mr. Gable turned his back, unable to meet my gaze. The neighbors who had once forbidden their children from playing near my shop stood frozen, realizing the true monstrousness of what they had cheered for 10 years ago. Damien stepped forward, pulling a heavy brass key from his suit pocket. The court has ordered the immediate liquidation of the Sterling estate to repay the embezzled funds, Damien announced to the crowd, his voice ringing with absolute authority. Every cent recovered will be transferred into a permanent charitable trust. And the head of that foundation sits right here on this porch. Julian reached into his coat and opened the velvet-lined wooden box he had carried from the car. Inside, resting on red silk, was the Presidential Medal for Exemplary Civic Sacrifice awarded for my actions during the shipyard disaster 15 years ago, a honor that had been delayed by years of red tape and lost files, finally recovered by my children. Julian lifted the heavy gold medal and gently placed the blue ribbon around my neck. The heavy gold medallion rested against the grease-stained chest of my blue work jumpsuit. 10 years ago, a judge sat in a warm courtroom and decided that a man with grease on his hands wasn't fit to be a father, Julian said, turning to face the townspeople directly. He looked at a man who took a burning beam on his back, a man who gave up his sight, a man who starved so his kids could learn, and he called him insolvent. Today, we stand here as a doctor, a financial director, and a federal attorney to tell you the truth. Julian walked up the steps, placing his hand firmly on my left shoulder. Damien took my right arm. Nora wrapped her arms around my waist, resting her head against my chest, just as she had done when she was 4 years old. Our father's hands were stained with motor oil, Julian declared, his eyes sweeping across the silent street, but his soul was the cleanest thing this town will ever see. A single clap echoed from the far end of the street, a young mechanic from the local supply store, then another joined in. Within seconds, a wave of applause rippled through the gathering crowd, a long overdue tribute from a town that had finally been forced to see the truth. 6 months later, the old, rusted sign above my workshop was taken down. In its place stood a handsome, hand-carved oak sign lit by warm lantern light. The Cross Foundation and a Youth Mechanics Academy. Where the burned-out storage shed once stood, a modern, two-story brick vocational center now provided free trade education, hot meals, and shelter to orphaned and underprivileged youth from across the state. It was a Saturday night, 8 o'clock sharp. Inside the academy's private living quarters, the heavy oak workbench from my original shop sat polished and gleaming in the center of the room. A massive cast-iron pot of beef and potato stew simmered on the stove, filling the room with the warm, rich scent of garlic bread and herbs. Julian was sitting at the head of the table, his surgical gown replaced by a comfortable sweater. Damian was seated beside him, going over the foundation scholarship applications. Nora was leaning over my shoulder, showing me the blueprints for the new library wing. I walked over to the deep industrial sink in the corner. I turned on the brass tap and pumped a dollop of orange pumice soap into my palms. Julian, Damian, and Nora stood up from the table without a word. They walked over to the basin, lining up beside me just as we used to do 15 years ago. Scrub, scrub, scrub. We washed our hands together under the warm running water, the suds swirling down the drain. I dried my hands on a clean towel, then looked at my 3 children. Around each of their necks, resting over their fine clothes, hung the worn brass gear necklaces I had carved for them when they were small. I looked at my reflection in the clean mirror above the sink. The scar on my neck was still there. My left eye was still clouded with gray. My hands were still rough, dark, and marked by a lifetime of hard labor. But as I looked at my children unbroken, triumphant, and bound together by an unshakable love, I knew that the fire had lost. The grease on a man's hands comes off with soap. Kids, I whispered,